Greetings from LA, my dear friends. This is Daisuke, and I very much hope that this video finds you well and in very good spirits wherever you are in the world. And today, if you don't mind, I would very much like to continue on with our journeys, our discussions, our discoveries, and our explorations with respect to the recent releases made by the JANUS Contemporaries lineup. In association with the Criterion channel and JANUS films. As we know, starting late last year in 2023, there is a new sub lineup that was announced utilizing the Blu-ray format under the title of JANUS Contemporaries. So far we've seen a number of really interesting titles that are indeed also associated with the Criterion Collection. We see these titles emerge and are showing up on, for instance, the Criterion Collection website. And so in that context, as well as the opportunity to talk about these films themselves, which I'm very fortunate to be able to see a lot of them for the first time thanks to these releases, these great releases. I'd like to very much share with you some thoughts and comments I have about them. So that brings us today to one of the more recent of the JANUS Contemporaries lineup releases from 2024. And this is of a work which is described as being from the year 2022. And the name of the filmmaker is Alexandre O, Philippe. And this is the first time for me to watch this film, courtesy of this great JANUS Contemporaries Blu-ray. And it is of this film, which is Lynch Oz. This is a very interesting film. Which is described as being from the year 2022. The name of the filmmaker is Alexandre O, Philippe. And this is a type of video essay or a collection of video essays or discussions from a number of voices, film critics and academic writers, as well as filmmakers and artists and other directors, etc. So it's a gathering of various voices that are presenting in a kind of a video essay form, and this film is a gathering of all these respective video essays. Talk about this very fascinating and important filmmaker, one of the most important filmmakers of our generation, one can say, and this is the filmmaker David Lynch. And specifically it's focusing in, or one of the ways one can say this film is approaching the David Lynch filmography is through the connections that one can say, or the speakers here are endeavoring to say through certain points of their discussions, some connection that could be said to be existent between the works of David Lynch on the one hand and the film The Wizard of Oz on the other. And so that forms the basis of this work, which is Lynch Oz. So Lynch Oz is, again, this is the occasion of this JANUS Contemporaries release. This release afforded me the opportunity to watch this film for the first time. And I was very excited about this. I heard a little bit about it, but not so much. So I was a lot of it was I was trying to keep I could be surprised when I watched the film without any spoilers along the way. So I did watch it with those sort of fresh eyes, in a manner of speaking. And on the one hand, I do understand and appreciate that the film and the speakers here in a kind of chapter form are looking at the body of Lynch, and in some instances David Lynch and Mark Frost, although Mark Frost I don't know if is acknowledged as much, because there are direct references and discussion points made with respect to Twin Peaks, the series Twin Peaks, and also Twin Peaks: The Return, which is one of the latest in terms of the stories of the world and a series of Twin Peaks. But that's not the only point that is mentioned, but there are other David Lynch directed works, but that's the Twin Peaks series. So there are a lot of ways in which this film, Lynch Oz, I think is trying to discuss through the voices of the speakers here, Lynch's work and The Wizard of Oz. So I understand, therefore, that the basic hypothesis that's being posited here is that The Wizard of Oz is this ubiquitous work that has its kind of expression of almost the fundamentals of storytelling. Um, maybe along maybe Aristotelian or Joseph Campbell type of reach of influence to the very fabric of storytelling, at least as we know it in the context of modern day filmmaking, and David Lynch's body of work being the prime, say, subject matter that is being examined, or one of the prime subject matters that are being examined here. I mean, the title is Lynch Oz. So, and the way in which the film is maybe endeavoring to prove or to support or buttress this hypothesis that's being posited is by using various speakers to express, say, points in which it might be argued that, say, a work like Mulholland Drive seems to be following certain story modes and plot progressions and character arcs that could be said to be derived right out of The Wizard of Oz. And perhaps for those who know the works of David Lynch, the example that might seem the most direct could be a film which is called Wild at Heart. I don't want to get into too much detail for those who have not yet seen this really incredible David Lynch film Wild at Heart, but suffice to say, it could be said that that film does have its share of direct references to The Wizard of Oz, that's for sure. And indeed, too, throughout other works of David Lynch, I think Twin Peaks being an example, that being David Lynch and Mark Frost, of course, but throughout other works, there are instances where direct Wizard of Oz references are being made. But I think what the film Lynch Oz is trying to do, or trying to posit in one of its hypotheses, is to suggest that there is what it's purporting to be maybe a kind of more fundamental element of storytelling that is embodied in the film The Wizard of Oz, or the story of The Wizard of Oz itself, that is then finding voice and expression. Maybe on purpose, or one can assume certain motivations of the filmmaker. David Lynch is not directly interviewed or anything throughout this, so it's a kind of, I think, a very healthy and reasonable speculation on the part of the film critics and filmmakers that are speaking here. But the notion is that aspects of the elements of storytelling, a la the Wizard of Oz, are finding voice and being manifested as well in other works, such as the works of David Lynch or the modern day. Mulholland Drive is mentioned here. Blue Velvet is mentioned here as well. Some aspects of the Straight Story as well. Some aspects of Inland Empire are mentioned as well. One of the ways, or one of the examples that the film is positing this hypothesis is the way in which waking states and dream states are mentioned. One of the things about The Wizard of Oz that's emphasized in this film, Lynch Oz, is the notion of dreams and waking up, or the dream world, and how we might wake up and find identities switched. People that we know in the real world. Dorothy knows certain people in the real world in the film The Wizard of Oz, but they might have different roles, or roles are reversed, or the like, when she enters into a different world, a kind of fantasy realm, which then could be said again in the context of The Wizard of Oz, and also by extension in some of these other films, such as the works of David Lynch, or in some instances Lynch and Frost, the way in which dreams and reality are either intertwined or also clashing with each other and against each other. And you can take from that all sorts of permutations, such as the discussion of identity and identity switches and multiple identities and crossing the line in that respect. You can also take into the fact a kind of dream logic that sometimes occurs, how violence in certain violent scenes are transmuted or otherwise expressed contextually via this dream logic. The Wicked Witch of the West is mentioned here, also the way in which villainy and evil are expressed, and also a kind of buffoonish quality of some of the supporting characters, etc. So there's a way that comedy and humor are also intertwined as well. And these kind of genre traits or storytelling modes are, again, the film, I think, in some aspects is positing that these are very much inherent in the Wizard of Oz, and thus the Wizard of Oz is kind of the starting point for a lot of films that we know in the present day, including the body of work of David Lynch, and then for Twin Peaks, David Lynch and Mark Frost. But uh, that is, I think, is the main trajectory of its hypothesis. Now, uh, based on how I perceive that hypothesis to have been stated here, at the end of the day, or when I watch the film, or after I finish the film, I'm not quite sure if I was totally on board with that hypothesis. I think it was maybe well argued, and I think well positioned by a number of the speakers here. But I personally am not sure that I'm totally on board with that hypothesis. Personally, that's not to say that I didn't wholly enjoy this film, Lynch Oz. I think there's a lot of love and affection towards David Lynch works, not just towards David Lynch works though, but there are also other films that are being mentioned here, and not just The Wizard of Oz too. There are also ways in which dream logic is expressed in modern day cinema. There's also many ways in which other works that aren't directed by David Lynch also seem to be borrowing heavily from The Wizard of Oz, thus giving credence to the hypothesis that The Wizard of Oz does have this type of ubiquity in cinema language, or TV, visual media, entertainment language, which I think is a very strong hypothesis to make. But I think what is I'm not sure of is whether it's indeed the case that everything stems from the Wizard of Oz per se, or whether the Wizard of Oz is itself a type of expression of maybe even more fundamental storytelling beats and motifs, the hero's journey, or elements of a Greek drama, etc. So that, or even elements that are predate The Wizard of Oz in a manner of speaking. So that's where I'm not quite sure I'm totally on board with the hypothesis that seems to be posited here. And also I would say too that even within the film itself, one can argue that the speakers and the video essays don't always stick to The Wizard of Oz. They seem to be taking the opportunity to maybe go off topic a little bit, but then go into ways in which they are really expressing their love of cinema. So I think I might be so taken, not wholly on board, but I can listen to the conversation with respect to the hypothesis about David Lynch and The Wizard of Oz. I'm kind of there, but I'm kind of not there. But when it goes into territory about maybe uh, pure, sort of undistilled expressions of love for cinema, and that's definitely the case here. And whether that love for cinema is expressed with David Lynch films as an example, or other films as an example, I think it's very wonderful and infectious, and quite a joy to hear. I would point out in particular, I think my favorite, personally speaking, my favorite of the visual essays, because there are various different speakers here, but my favorite of the essays, the speaking, has to be John Waters. In one of the mid chapters here, I love John Waters' discussion here, and he delivers it in the great John Waters way. I understand that the words are written, and they were not scripted per se, but they were prepared in writing, and they were then read out after much discussion, a free-form discussion between the filmmaker and the speaker. So I understand that therefore the final product is one where the words are being read out as a type of a script that's being read out based upon notions and ideas that were initially the speakers, based upon the kind of free-form interviews with the filmmaker Philippe. So that's how I understand the process was made. But I in particular like how John Waters reads, because there are some moments where you can tell that he's not reading, he's just speaking off the cuff, which I love. I really love that. And I'm a huge admirer of John Waters. And too, the film, I think, really nicely and poignantly points out and reminds us of the connection, the kind of deep connection between the early career of John Waters and the early career of David Lynch, which is lovely. The cross. The way that their paths crossed in terms of Pink Flamingos and Eraserhead, the ultimate combination of the midnight movie culture, and how one filmmaker really supported the other and promoted the other, which is really nice. Also, Big Boy Restaurant is mentioned here in this discussion. So, whenever you get a reference to Big Boy in a discussion of John Waters and David Lynch, wow, that is a combination made in heaven. And after all, in heaven, everything is fine. So, there are moments here where I find myself, in particular, just glowing and just reveling and just loving and gushing over the love of cinema that's being had here. In particular, when that love of cinema is expressed with regard to a filmmaker that I really admire, that being the world of David Lynch, and then for Twin Peaks, Mark Frost and David Lynch. When you're talking about this, it really sends me over the moon. So in that respect, I'm very, very happy with this. So I'm of different minds on this work. On the one hand, where I look at this film as a kind of regard for cinema, love for cinema, I find I'm very taken with it. When I try to look at this film as a kind of attempt to position David Lynch's works as a kind of fashioning of storytelling modes that we find in what is purported to be a kind of fundamental storytelling archetype of the Wizard of Oz, that's where it loses me a little bit. So but it makes I think a great effort in trying to prove that point, and so one can judge when one watches it whether the point is successfully proven or not. I mean, you can be the judge of that. So I very much invite you to do so because I think it is at the end of the day, I think, a very compelling argument that is being made. So I think kudos for at least challenging one's feeling about the connection between David Lynch and the Wizard of Oz, and also reminding us too about how prominent, in fact, the Wizard of Oz is in terms of storytelling, not just of David Lynch films but elsewhere. I should point out as a kind of maybe just a note of caution that this film does refer to David Lynch works, as it has to, and also Twin Peaks, Lynch and Frost. But it does refer to moments that are, I think, quite definitely spoilers. I mean, there's a scene that's shown of Twin Peaks: The Return that's a huge spoiler for that series. So, my strong recommendation is please do not watch this film until you have seen the works of David Lynch and until you have seen Twin Peaks: The Return, or if you don't mind being spoiled in some degree. It doesn't spoil everything, but there are some significant spoilers that are had here, and so I just urge caution when watching this. But if you've seen the works already and you're confident that Lynch works through and through, and Twin Peaks through and through, then I think this might be an interesting potential source of discussion. This work, Lynch Oz. So again, I'm overall impressed. Not quite on board with maybe some of the hypothesis discussion that's being had, but that doesn't take away from my feeling of being impressed with this work. This is the film, which is Lynch Oz. So this work, Lynch Oz, is released under the JANUS Contemporaries label, and the Blu-ray is right here. It's a single disc Blu-ray. On the back it says 2022, 109 minutes, color and black and white, 5.1 surround, 1.77 to 1 aspect ratio. So we have the work here. There are no other details with regard to presentation or transfer, master information and the like, but that's to be expected. The JANUS Contemporaries lineup doesn't focus on those sorts of details about the transfer, about the master, except for the details, the fundamental details that we find on the back of the cover. But that's okay. That's not a problem. This is a Contemporaries lineup, so these are films so far from 2022 2022, 2023, thereabouts. So in that way, maybe the need for information about the Transfer Master is not so, say, pronounced as maybe other works where that have had an earlier release from some years back, but then have undergone restoration work and the like. So maybe we're not talking about that territory, therefore some of that information may not necessarily be immediately necessary, although it would have been nice to have. But oh well, that's okay. That's part of this Janus Contemporaries lineup. The one thing too to keep in mind is I have the disc in the player here, so it has this green motif. Emerald City and curtains as well, and also a lovely artistic rendering of a person, and we assume this is David Lynch. With cigarette in hand and coiffed hairdo in that oh so David Lynch way. And then we have the movie. There aren't any chapter sections here, although it is divided into chapters when you press the chapter button or the next button or previous button on your remote control. And the chapters are divided in the chapters of the film. So the film is divided into various chapters with chapter headings, and so. Actually, speaking of the chapters, sometimes the chapters themselves will have, like, there's one chapter I'm thinking of that there's a name that's being used, or the way that's titled, that could be said to be kind of a big spoiler for Twin Peaks, for example. So I would very much urge caution if you're into Twin Peaks, but you haven't finished watching Twin Peaks. I would say hold off on watching this. You don't have to ignore it completely, and you can finish watching Twin Peaks and then come back and watch this, including The Return. You watch Twin Peaks The Return all the way up to the very end, so you know what happened, so then you won't be spoiled when you watch and enjoy some of the details of Lynch Oz. But just keep that in mind. It's true for the chapters, but so in any way, why did I mention chapters here? Because while there isn't any chapters part of the sub menu or the Blu-ray menu, it is divided up into chapters, so you can jump from chapter to chapter by pressing the button on your remote control. And then there's a section of Meet the Filmmakers. And this is 17 minutes, and this is a one-on-one interview with the filmmaker, Alexandre O, Philippe. And I didn't realize this until I saw Alexandre O, Philippe, but this is, I recognized him, except, just show how ignorant I am and my very poor knowledge base. But then I then recognized him and understood that I saw him in terms of his work was The People versus George Lucas. And I remember seeing him as a guest on a very popular and famous YouTube channel, a film-related channel called Red Letter Media. So very interesting. And so then I put two and two together. Oh, this is the filmmaker that made Lynch Oz. And it's great too, because there is very evidently a love of cinema that's just embedded in the very fiber of his being. And he talks about a little bit about his background and upbringing and sort of biography. And growing up in Europe and Switzerland, and there's this idea too of the films that he watched as a kid, and also collecting. There's an interesting anecdote that he brings up about early on in his life about stamp collecting, about collecting the same stamp, but he understood that each stamp, even though it was the same stamp, there were some intricate differences in that the repetitive quality of the same stamp that was being collected. So that kind of taught him a certain life lesson, in a manner of speaking, in terms of examining details and finding nuanced differences, even in things that are maybe on the surface or on paper seemingly the same or identical. So a really interesting aspect in this way. And then also just expression of the importance of the works of David Lynch. Mulholland Drive is cited as a very important example to this filmmaker. It's really nice to see. And it's good to see, too, that he acknowledges how maybe, the idea of trying to prove the hypothesis of the links between The Wizard of Oz and David Lynch, the idea being, again, one of the, I think, one of the most immediate associations one can make would be with the film Wild at Heart and Wizard of Oz. But I think Alexandre Philippe does a really good job in trying to show other examples Wild at Heart is featured, I think, quite prominently here, and rightly so, for good reason. But other films are as well, as I mentioned, Inland Empire, Twin Peaks, in particular Twin Peaks: The Return, and also Mulholland Drive. There is some reference to other films like The Elephant Man. Blue Velvet is referenced a lot. Eraserhead is referenced somewhat. Dune, but I would say maybe just as a general impression, the latter part of his filmography and body of work, including Twin Peaks, maybe is referenced more than the earlier part of his filmography. And that's just a sense that I have. So it would have been nice to try to get more of his earlier work even more fully integrated into this discussion of Lynch Oz, or the hypothesis of the Wizard of Oz, but that's okay. I mean, I don't mind that too much. I would say too, just to jump off of this point as well, I wouldn't necessarily call this a primer into the world of David Lynch per se. So, for instance, if you are looking for a film that is introducing you to the world of David Lynch, maybe you are new to the world of the films of David Lynch and you're looking for a film that's charting or cataloging the career and filmography of David Lynch, I wouldn't call Lynch Oz that type of work. It's not a primer into David Lynch films. It's more of a kind of ode to cinema a la David Lynch via Wizard of Oz. That's one way of looking at it. And it does make some, I think, insightful points in a lot of avenues and respects. But I look at it as a kind of ode and an expression of the joy and love of cinema, such as, for example, the world of David Lynch. So in that way, it's not a primer per se. So I would look at it only if you have already a confident grounding in Twin Peaks and in other works by David Lynch, rather than looking at it from sort of approaching the world of David Lynch films for the first time. So, but I think that is itself implicit in a lot of the comments that Alexandre O Philippe is mentioning in this great interview that he has here as well. And also, he mentions he mentions too the process of making the film and getting the participants to participate, having free-form interviews first that sometimes would last hours and hours and hours, and trying to pinpoint those, and also the idea of telling a story. These are quote-unquote documentaries, and these are not narrative fiction films per se, but that doesn't make them any less how should I put it, doesn't make the editing process for these sorts of films any less important. And in fact, he makes a point that the editing process and arranging the writing and the words was very meticulous. There are so many clips also that are referred to, and one thing that's really great about this film, you go to the end credits, the closing credits, the closing credit scroll. When it gets to the tail end of that, you see a list of all the films that are cited by the chapter that they appear in. And some instances, not all, but some instances, you might even get time marks. So that is really, really that's hardcore dedication. I'm very, very impressed with that. So it's an example that the filmmaker Philippe is mentioning here about how it's a very meticulous process, and there is a storytelling process involved, and he focuses in on trying to establish a certain point with the first chapter, and then trying to establish this, now that's been established, going off of that, jumping off of that with the second chapter, and then having a kind of palate cleanser. He calls the John Waters section a palate cleanser, which is a very interesting point. But and then trying to talk more about sort of trying to draw the conversation in a kind of a through line sort of way. And so in that way, I would then maybe take a step back upon listening to that comment in this great interview, and just take a step back from a purely maybe critical perspective, just maybe suggest that maybe in that way, sometimes, again, from my point of view, excuse me, the Wizard of Oz ball is sometimes dropped, but maybe it becomes a point where I have to then regard the film not necessarily as focusing wholly all the time on the Wizard of Oz, because it doesn't, but then looking at it in terms of the joy of cinema that's being celebrated. So that's what I was meaning by looking at it with two different minds. I think that's expressed very well in some of the words here that is voiced by the filmmaker Philippe. So all in all, I think this is a very insightful indication into the filmmaking process of this artist and the love of cinema and the love of Lynch films directly and specifically, and The Wizard of Oz for that matter as well. Of course, obviously. So very interesting. Meet the filmmakers here. Again, this is approximately 17 minutes, and then there is a trailer that is accompanying here as well. It's a very good trailer, so please check that out if you can. And then just returning to the box, you know, this I like this cover art design here. It's a very clean and cool looking cover art design, mimicking what we also see with the Blu-ray menu, which is on the screen here, and the spotlight motif and the like. And I like how even the font is very much something that we might see used in, say, Twin Peaks Fire Walk With Me font and the like. I really like that. And then we have the fold out here, which is a fold out affair. The Michael Joshua Rowan essay is included, Lynch Oz Over the Rainbow, which is the writing here. My strong suggestion is to watch the film Lynch Oz first, and then you can read this great essay by Michael Joshua Rowan. So yes, that's my impression with respect to Lynch Oz. This was my first time to watch this work, and I was very welcoming of its endeavor. I think it's a good-hearted endeavor to try to posit this hypothesis. But I think for me, I'm taken with it even more in terms of how the participants are really expressing their joy of cinema in this wonderful way. Through this ode to The Wizard of Oz and this ode to Twin Peaks and Lynch Frost, and then also the films directed by David Lynch. So in that way, I regard this film with a very interesting and keen eye indeed. This is the work which is Lynch Oz. All right, my dear friends, so that's it for now. And so until we meet again, please be happy and healthy and well. And please keep on watching a lot of great movies. So thank you very much for your time. And so until the next video, stay strong, stay safe, and cheers.